We have some error bars in the number of lectures. It's roughly 55 at this point. It depends if you count the optional ones and evening ones or not. Anyway, it's a large number. So thanks for hanging in there. Let me repeat the announcement you've heard several times maybe if you've been here. As Michelle aptly put it, this is a grand canonical ensemble. Now we have some kind of occupation fluctuations. We have the final feedback and discussion session right after Chinmar's talk. 11:45 is about whenever we're done with discussion, so we just have it immediately. You should still have ample time to go to lunch, so please stay. We definitely need your feedback and any positive and negative things you have in organization, content, whatever you can think of. Don't complain about the weather though, we cannot control that. If it's been too hot, and independent of that, in addition to that or whatever, please do fill in your feedback forms. You've heard several times that this older school grant is up for renewal, so they need feedback and anything you have, constructive, positive, negative. But it's really good to have those.
I actually tried to do that this morning and I was asked for a password. I have no idea what that might be.
You should have received an email with a password included.
Somewhere. Okay.
That was sent 2 weeks ago. Exactly.
Okay.
Maybe we should.
Friday of the first week.
If we can look it up and we could just put it up.
It's the same password for everyone?
Could the email be resent?
Well, the problem is we don't have control over these emails. That's one of the gripes we have.
So if
this is done at Yale and we have to negotiate with them and it takes days usually. So probably not too easy. But is it the same password?
The password is BOULD 09COND.
Not sure. But I put it here.
Older.
BOULD.
Does anyone have the same password? Okay. Okay. Seems to be the only password.
So that's the password.
Yeah.
Okay, with that, we look forward to Erwin's third lecture, now on spatially extended games.
Thanks for hanging in there. This science camp. Sure, I can. Turn the lights off.
Not those in the back, we need to stay awake.
Yeah, soon over. Okay, let me remind you what we are up to. My motivation was to explain this particular experiment from the CARE group, where they've studied this rock, scissors, paper game in E. coli, and the two findings were that for a class which is a well-mixed situation, you would have loss of biodiversity with only the resistance strain remaining, and for the spatial game, you would have maintenance of biodiversity with all three strains remaining over a long time period. So that's what we are up to. And yesterday I explained to you why we actually lose biodiversity in a well-mixed context. And the punchline, I think something which you can take with you, is that the extinction time in three different scenarios, neutral games, games with a stable reactive fixed point and with an unstable reactive fixed point, have different scaling properties. Neutral games go extinct after time scales proportional to system size. Games with a stable reactive fixed point need an exponential time scale in the system size, and unstable reactive fixed points go extinct in times logarithmic in n. And because of the fact that the rock, scissors, paper game is a neutral game, or even an unstable game, you would have very fast extinction of the species, so you would be left with one species only. And I told you, because of the particular geometry, of the flow in the nonlinear dynamics, it's always the weakest species, namely the resistant one, which will survive the game. Then I talked about yesterday nonlinear dynamics, and I know this was a bit mathematical, but it's necessary to understand the spatial dynamics. Let me repeat what we did. So we analyzed, is that the transparency I wanted? Well, so we analyzed the nonlinear dynamics of the May-Leonard model. You can write this as the nonlinear dynamics equation, and this then gives the following flow behavior shown on the transparency. And the essential idea is to move the reference frame to the fixed point, then rotate the reference frame such that the linear dynamics is simplest. That's the Jordan normal form. And then you have the nonlinear terms remaining in the equation. In the next step, you say, well, I want to go beyond the linear description, so I want to project on this orange manifold, which I call the reactive manifold. You do so by calculating the manifolds to the leading order. You plug this into the form which is most appropriate for the linear dynamics. Then you end up with this set of two coupled equations. This here is a spiral, and those are the nonlinear terms. And now there's a second step which you can do, which is quite nice. You can actually get rid of a lot of nonlinearities by a nonlinear transformation. That's very general. You can look this up, for example, in the book by Wiggins. I've also put on the web an extended set of lecture notes where I really talk about all the mathematical details, and you can read that if you like later on.
I should add the reading material section.
Yeah, it's in the reading material section, yeah. So that's the point. You can do a nonlinear transformation from this reference frame Y to a reference frame Z, and out comes a very, very simple equation. If you write it in complex notation, you have a linear term, which is the spiral, and you have a nonlinear term, and you see here, comparing this result with that result, you got rid of the quadratic nonlinearity, and you only left with a third order nonlinearity. So that's the simplest form you can write down. Now, looking at that, you can even calculate all the quantities which are in that equation as a function of the selection and reproduction rates. That's very important because you know now all the coefficients, and once you're able to analyze that equation without any kind of fitting parameter, you can study the behavior of the system as a function of all those rates.
Were there higher order terms that you dropped at this point?
Yeah, I dropped terms which are of the order c to the fourth. Here you could make the same argument as in renormalization group theory. Those terms are relevant if the dynamics goes far away from z equal to 0, but that's not the case. Okay, so you can make it even simpler by going to polar coordinates. Sorry, the misprint, that should be a phi. Then you see that the dynamics of the radius is decoupled from the dynamics of the angle phi. And for the radius, this is a very simple one-dimensional nonlinear dynamics equation. It has a fixed point at r equals c1 over c2, and that's simply the limit cycle you get from analyzing nonlinear dynamics. So in summary, by doing all the math, you really gain something. You end up at this set of equations where you know that essentially the dynamics of this game is one where you have an unstable fixed point running out, and most of the physics is described by some kind of limit cycle in the dynamics. Okay. So mapping of a nonlinear rate equation to reactive manifold and reducing it to normal form is really essential for the well-mixed dynamics, and as you will see, it's also essential for understanding the spatial dynamics. Now we come to spatial models. Here, instead of talking about interactions between individuals which are well mixed, I have to define what the interaction range of the selection and reproduction is, and I take a nearest neighbor rule. I say if A is next to a B, then with a certain rate sigma, the A is killing the B and generating an empty site, which I denote by 0, and those empty sites are filled with our birth rate, mu, randomly of course, and whoever is first, red, blue or yellow, will then occupy the empty site. In space, in addition to the reactions, you can also add mobility, and the way I do this is that I add a rate epsilon, which promotes the exchange of two different individuals, or equivalently, if there's an empty site, a blue tile here could also hop to the empty site. That's the rule how I build in mobility. You could make it differently, but on a coarser scale, on a long length scale, it shouldn't really matter how you model this specifically. Okay, here is the result of what you get if you put this all on a computer. This here is for a hopping rate, which I transfer into a diffusion constant, which is low, and you see from this computer simulation the emergence of spiral waves, and those spiral waves actually change in their velocity, their wavelength, and their size as I increase the diffusion constant. So that's an observation which you simply make by doing a computer experiment. Okay? So that means now we have a loss of biodiversity for well-mixed population because we have this unstable fixed point. We do see that there's some interesting structure for low diffusivity, and that this structure actually changes in its size as I change the value of the diffusion constant. So the most prominent observation there is that the size of the spiral grows larger as the diffusion constant grows larger. And then you immediately get to the question, is there maybe a critical value for this diffusion constant which marks a transition from a pattern-forming state to a state where you lose the biodiversity, which would then be an absorbing state where you have only one species left in your system.
Does it matter if it's just diffusion? Because you also have exchange. That mixes things more than just nearest neighbor hopping.
I think we didn't check it, I guess, but that changes the value at which the transition happens, I would assume. I don't think that changes the physics. But I would need to check. I don't know. So, if yes, so if there is some critical value, the question would be what the stable structure is which helps to maintain the biodiverse state. You already saw that structure. Those are the spiral waves, but I need to explain why they emerge and why they have the properties you see. Okay, and another question is how we describe the transition if it exists. And for that, I need these simple scaling laws, which I started out with today. So remember, neutral gain is t proportional to n. One with a stable fixed point has an exponential in n, and one unstable fixed point has a logarithmic in n. So, in order to define a transition in such a system, where you always have an absorbing state, you need to talk about time scale. And my definition of stability here is that if t is the typical extinction time and n is the system size, then I just call a system stable if the scaling t over n is towards infinity as n goes to infinity. That's typically the case where t goes exponential in n and the other divided by linear in n. I call a system marginal or at the critical point if the scaling t over n is such that this goes to a number of the order of 1, and you saw that was the case for the neutral rock scissor paper game where you just had a random walk on the face plan. And the last point would be an unstable system where you have an unstable reactive fixed point, for example. There t was typically the logarithm of n, and then t over n would scale to 0 as n goes to infinity. So that's the definition which I want to take in order to define when the system is in one state or the other. So here, that's how we then finally do it. So we define a certain probability, which is the probability that only one species survives after a time which is of the order of n. So if this scales to 0 or 1, I know whether I am in a system which is stable or unstable. And here are the data. So you see here the extinction probability plotted as a function of the diffusion constant for different system sizes. Here you have a small system size, larger, even larger, and that's the largest system size. Note that that's a logarithmic scale. And now as this probability scales to 1, I know that I'm in a state where for sure I will have extinction in the definition I have. And if this here scales to 0, I know I'm in a state where I have biodiversity, meaning that my extinction time scales with a higher power in n, and as we know from the simulation, it scales exponentially in n. And right at the transition, the scaling is proportional to it. And you see, as the system size goes to infinity, you really have this whole thing approach a step function with 0 below a critical diffusion constant and 1 above a certain diffusion constant. So you really see there is a transition from one state to the other in the sense I've defined it.
Yeah. So this is just pure diffusion. There's no dependence on the local situation.
There's no dependence on the local situation. If I would do it like Uwe has suggested, then I would make the diffusion dependent on the local situation. Then I would only allow things to hop to empty sites. And actually, I think it makes a difference. The point is, the number of empty sites is really sparse. And if you would hook diffusion to only occupation of empty sites, the system would slow down tremendously. It would be as if there would be no diffusion. You really need the exchange of the particles.
Well, you could add multiple occupations though, and then you would overlap.
Yeah. That's actually very interesting to look at. Multiple occupations change the picture, and but that's a whole other story. Very interesting to look at that there. Okay, right now that's an observation of such a transition, and now you need to explain it. In the biodiverse state, you have a finite population density of all three species. So that's kind of the easier part maybe, because there you have a macroscopic number of each of the individuals, and you expect the noise to be important, but to not be as important as, for example, in diffusion reaction systems where you would have A plus A going to 0, where you need to worry about low particle numbers as the system approaches the extinct state. On the other hand, if you are in this part of the phase diagram, where the system approaches the extinct state, there you would need to worry about describing the noise in a very detailed way along the lines of the Delitti formalism. Okay, so let's go on. That's what we observed. For large systems, we have a well-defined threshold. Threshold depends, of course, on the reproduction rate and the selection rate, and it's a critical threshold. The loss of biodiversity seems to be related to the spatial structure, the spirals in the population, and if you want to play with the model, there's a demonstration project on the Wolfram web page, which a student, Martin Weidel, has composed. Yeah.
So you say it just depends on the birth and selection rate. Doesn't it also depend on the diffusion rate?
The diffusion rate is my parameter. I was asking.
I thought you had an exchange rate epsilon that was not dependent.
Maybe I was too fast on that. You have an exchange rate epsilon, which is the local switching of particles, And now as you go to a macroscopic system size, this leads to an effective diffusion constant. Okay, and this effective diffusion constant D equals the hopping rate essentially divided by the system size. There's also a factor of 2. So there's a one-to-one relation between this microscopic parameter and a macroscopic parameter which describes diffusion. Sorry for being explicit on that. So here, if you want to play with it, this is on the Wolfram webpage. You find a link on my webpage to this demonstration project. You can run this for different reproduction, selection, and mobility rates. This is, of course, not a large simulation. It's a small simulation. And the problem is, of course, that in Mathematica you cannot really do large-scale simulations, but you can do nice demonstrations. You see that there's a spatial dynamics going on. You don't see the spirals. At the same time, in the simulation, you have where the whole system is on the phase portrait. You see it circles around the reactive center, and you kind of see that you have this quasi-limit cycle forming because the dynamics is for a long time period just on a fuzzy limit cycle which runs from one corner to the other. And as you would watch this going on, there's a small system size, so fluctuations are large. In the end, you will end up at one of the absorbing states, and then the system will just flash back and forth between the different colors, red, blue, and yellow. But I think I don't have to do this right now. If you like, you can play with it.
What you're simulating here is again that discrete kind of reaction.
Yes.
While the theory you've shown us was for the kind of slightly artificially replicated dynamics, which looks like mean field. So the mean field limit seems to be about the same as the restriction. It's not quite the same.
Okay, what you can do, and I'm doing this also, is you can start with the master equation for the rocks, for the May-Leonard model, and then, which is this here, then you can transform the master equations by a step of several transformations to a stochastic partial differential equation containing a diffusion term, which is the hopping, containing a reaction term, which is similar to replicator dynamics, but it's derived from the master equation. And then you have additionally some kind of noise, and the noise is obtained by a Kramers-Moyal expansion, and you have to worry about, is that noise coming from the hopping, or is the noise coming from the reactions? And it turns out the noise is only coming from the reactions. There's some noise from the diffusion, but it's subleading in a large particle number expansion. So I'm really going from the microscopic model to a macroscopic description, and you will see it's a faithful description all the way to differential equations. So let me come back. There goes. So now to the mathematical description. So let's forget about the noise for a moment and write down what the equation of motion should be without the noise. And that's pretty obvious actually, because on the long length scale limit, this hopping here has to translate in an effective diffusion, and the reactions, the local reactions, have to just be added to this equation in a very naive way, neglecting noise. I mean, if you have noise, you need to worry about how you set up an equation like that, but without noise, that's obvious. And now you see the power of all the math I did, because what I do now is I take this equation, go through the steps of the mapping to the reactive manifold, and I end up with the same kind of reaction terms, but just a diffusion term added. And this is an equation which has some glory in the physics of nonlinear dynamics. There are reviews about it by Kramer, by Wim van Salos, Owenberg, and Cross, and many, many other people. So everything is really known about the behavior of this complex Ginsburg-Lambda equation, this beautiful, beautiful physics. And what it turns out, and that's the main message by looking at such an equation, this equation has spiral waves as a solution. So it tells you immediately, once you know the step from here to here, the spirals which we saw in the computer simulations are due to the fact that the normal form of my diffusion reaction in the spatial dynamics is a Ginsburg-Lambda equation in the complex form. And of course you can generalize that. If you have any kind of other model described by nominal dynamics and you put it onto space, all you need to do is to go through the same kind of steps. Okay. What's interesting here, and that makes it special, is that the state C equal to 0, which was my reactive fixed point, is unstable. So that means if you start with a flat configuration, and this flat configuration is unstable, you develop a perturbation by anything which perturbs it, for example noise, and then this perturbation you generate grows and moves. So let me give you a picture. This is a picture from a review article by Wim van Salos, which is really a pleasure to read. So here you have a very general field phi with an unstable fixed point phi equal to 0. You have a local perturbation which you generate either by noise or by hand. And then because of the instability of the fixed point phi equal to 0, this perturbation grows until finally the nonlinear terms keep it from growing and give a kind of wave front which then propagates with a certain speed, v star, into the medium. And to derive this velocity v star is actually easy to do. I want to show it to you. So what you do is you go, you just forget about the linear terms, because for the emergence of such a front it's not important to think about the nonlinear terms. They're important for capping the growth of the pulse. So you have this linear diffusion reaction equation, which is just a diffusion equation with a source. And of course, the way you analyze that is in terms of Fourier transform. So you Fourier transform and you make an ansatz for each Fourier mode k. You say each Fourier mode k is an amplitude which depends on k times an exponential factor which contains a frequency omega of k, which is simply the dispersion relation of the property. Plugging this in, you get the dispersion relation, and you see omega of k is omega, so the frequency of the spiral in the well-mixed case, plus a term which depends on the growth of the spiral, again, just in the well-mixed case, and you add a dispersion term which comes from the spatial extension of the property. Now, well, you plug this into your Fourier transform, your Fourier back transform, and now you go to a reference frame where you move with the front. And once you move with the front, you see you can determine the velocity by two conditions. The first condition is that in the limit of t going to infinity, the contribution from that integral comes from those places in k-space where the variation of those factors are small. So you do a saddle point expansion, and the saddle point expansion gives you that the velocity v star is the derivative of the frequency, as you know from other courses like this. The second condition which you have here is, since you're in the co-moving frame, your leading front should neither grow nor shrink. It should be stationary. And being stationary means that the imaginary part of this thing here is 0. And this gives you the second condition. And those two conditions together give you the saddle point k star and the speed of the moving front. And you can do the math, of course, by plugging in this dispersion relation and determine the velocity of the wave front. And you will see that this velocity actually is sufficient to understand the velocity of the spiral waves, even in the case where we have noise. Okay. So what about noise? I was mentioning this already in discussion with Uwe. Noise here is simple to implement in the state where you have biodiversity. It's a bit more subtle in the case where you have extinction. I will only focus on the case where you have biodiversity. And then it's also not too hard to imagine what comes out. So this already is something we have. This is the deterministic part, and this function A is the function F from linear dynamics. But now, the way I derived those equations was really following standard steps how you treat master equations. So you take your master equations, you do a Kramers-Moreau expansion, and that's it. That's all you need to do. And out comes from the Kramers-Moreau expansion that the reactive term is the one which you guess naively, that has to be the case. And there is a noise term. This noise term has a multiplicative structure. Psi here is a white noise, and the multiplicative factor depends on the configuration of my system. And importantly, this here is 1 over square root of n. And this is exactly the same reason as in the simplified explanation I gave last time, where I would derive an effective diffusion constant being 1 over n. That's the reason why you have here a 1 over square root of n. And note also this, of course, has to be positive. And the only problem I would face with this multiplicative noise is if, for some reason, my concentration of particles A, B, or C would become 0 at some instant in time. And since I'm in a reactive state, that's not the case. So the influence of this noise term is first of all scaled by this factor 1 over square root of n, and we do not expect that it changes dramatically the local dynamics, but only in a way which is rather mild. Okay. So now you can look at this equation, which is derived, the low noise approximation, and see how good is such a description, how does it compare with the cellular automaton, so just the rules put on the computer. And you see it compares on a visual inspection extremely well. You just take different diffusion constants. This row here is for the stochastic lattice simulation, and the row below is for the stochastic reaction diffusion equation. You see they look very similar. The structures are very similar, the wavelength is similar, and even the number and size of the spirals. Of course, you should not trust pictures. You should really look at correlation functions, and you can do so in very straightforward fashion. So we define, for example, a spatial correlation function which would measure the correlation between species AI and AJ at the same time, but at different space points. What do you get? Well, what you find out is that the lattice simulation is a red curve, and the stochastic PDE is the blue curve, and the green curve is actually the deterministic PDE. You see there's deviations between the deterministic PDE partial differential equation and the stochastic partial differential equation in the magnitude of the oscillations that is expected because noise kind of smoothens out the system, but the wavelength or decay length is the same. But importantly, I would say the stochastic partial differential equation and the lattice simulation really agree quantitatively within the limits you would expect for the system. And something which you also see is if you now study this correlation function as a function of the diffusion constant d, you realize that the decay constant, the correlation length, which is plotted here, scales as the square root of p. That's not a surprise. That just simply comes out from scaling of the equations because you have a diffusion equation. But it's important since as you change diffusion constant, your spirals become larger, larger, and larger, and at some value of diffusion constant they will hit the system boundary, and that's actually the mechanism for loss of biodiversity in the system. Now the same question you can not only ask for spatial correlations, but of course also for temporal correlations. Now you fix the correlation to be at the same space point R, and you ask what's the correlation between species I and J at different times. Again, I've plotted the Latin simulation and the stochastic PDE, and in green the deterministic partial differential equation, and you see they follow nicely each other. So we really know now this is a faithful description. Yes?
How long does it take before they start departing from each other? How long does it take before they start departing from each other? I mean, eventually that happens, right?
Mm-hmm.
No?
Doesn't.
Isn't there some damping in the autocorrelation function?
No.
No.
Well, not on the time scale which we look at. What you saw is that these spiral waves are moving in the system, and the vortex center on the time scale we look at is fixed. If you wait for ages, which I can't, then these vortex centers would move. They must show some kind of random walk on a huge time scale. And then these vortices collide, and you have spirals annihilating, and so on and so forth. That gives you damping. But this is way, out of the time window I can look at.
Is there any way of estimating that time scale?
Pardon?
Can you estimate that time scale or get an approximation of it?
I think you could, but it's humongous. So I would need to think about it. You need to think about mechanisms for a vortex to move. And it's very hard because the only way the vortex can move, they're empty sides, so you need to move the whole structure. And it's like with a conservation law, and the time scale scales as the size of the spiral, which is macroscopic. So it's a huge time scale. Okay, thanks for asking. Now, back to the description. So we saw that this here is a faithful description, and even without the noise, things like the correlation length or the oscillation frequency came out quite nicely from the deterministic partial differential equation. And that's why we say, well, if you really want to understand quantitatively what's going on in the system, it may be sufficient just to look at the deterministic partial differential equation. And we use that to determine the parameters in the model. So, as I said, we project on the reactive manifold and neglect the noise and see what comes out of it. That's the result. So these two results here for the spreading velocity, that's the one I showed you on the previous transparency. You can relate this to your diffusion constant, to the birth rate, selection rates. You can do the same thing in analyzing the complex Ginsburg-Lambda equation to determine the wavelength of the spiral. And the nonlinearity is actually important in the whole discussion. And you see that by the coefficient C3 entering the wavelength of the spiral. That was the coefficient in the place of the nonlinear term. And now you see you can compare the analytical result for the no-noise complex Ginsburg-Lambda equation, that's the red line, with the data points taken from the stochastic simulation, and that fits nicely. It doesn't fit perfectly, but I wouldn't expect that. There should be deviations because there is noise, and we have neglected parts in the system which are nonlinear. Question, yes?
So you had showed a curve in the spatial correlation plot that came from the deterministic equation. Is that this?
The deterministic equation is the complex Ginsburg-Lambda equation. But in the simulation, we actually took the full deterministic equation, and we were not approximating the deterministic equation by the complex Ginsburg-Lambda equation.
Okay.
Since the complex Ginsburg-Lambda equation, by doing that mapping to the reactive manifold, throws away quite a nonlinearity. And as I told you,
So this is a little bit more.
it's a little bit more, but this here now is comparing it with the complex Ginzburg-Landau equation, where I actually made some approximations. And remember, in reducing it to complex Ginzburg-Landau, I actually found a limit cycle instead of a heteroclinic orbit. So the complex Ginzburg-Landau pushes the system closer to the reactive center as it really should, because you don't have this limit cycle. And you actually see this here. Here, note, this is the result for the complex Ginzburg-Landau equation, and it does not fit the data. And the reason is clear. This is a nonlinear effect. The nonlinear effect is determined by trajectories which are away from the reactive center. So here it comes in that I have an approximation where I would have a limit cycle instead of a heteroclinic cycle. And I'm overestimating the effect of nonlinear term. What I can do is I just shift the whole curve by a factor, and then you get the blue curve, and you see the functional form is in very nice agreement with the numerical data. So I would say you fully understand the problem in terms of the complex Ginzburg-Landau equation, even on a quantitative level, and this shift here by a factor of 1.3 or so is expected and doesn't really change the functional behavior. So now you can go a step further and ask the question, what about now the transition from a biodiverse state to a mixed state? And the mechanism here really is simple. All we really do is you have a finite system and your spiral waves grow. They grow in diameter, and there's a certain value of diffusion constant where they're actually roughly of the size of the system. And once they're of the size of the system, you're really mixing and stirring your system well, such that you are in a regime where in a well-mixed scenario, and once you are then above a certain critical value, the system dies out. So you can just estimate this transition point by saying the diffusion constant is such that the size of the spiral is of the size of the system. There's a constant factor which you have to guess, right? You can say it's 1.5 times the system size or 1.7 times the system size. What turns out is that independent of the birth rate and reaction rate, there's a universal number which tells you where the transition lies. So it's one number which I have to choose for all reaction and birth rates, which then gives me the transition from one state to the other. And this is then the curve. So here you have the growth rate, here you have the diffusion constant, and in this plot I fixed the selection rate to be equal to 1. Then you see what happens as I'm in a regime of low growth rate. I have a diffusion constant which is low, and then this diffusion constant, which marks the transition between the two states, grows linearly with the growth rate, and at a value of mu being equal to sigma, the system saturates and actually has this boundary. Again, if you compare the three different approaches, the blue dots here are for the stochastic lattice simulation, the black dots are for the stochastic partial differential equation, and the red line here is the line which you obtain from the complex Ginzburg-Landau equation. It really gives you a quantitative explanation of this kind of phase transition. Okay. So now my conclusions. Too fast, I think. Okay, wait. My conclusions are that for well-mixed populations, you do have always extinction, and you have something which I call the law of the weakest, where just the one species with the lowest reproduction rate would die out. That's something which is an important conclusion in the present case. The second conclusion is that if you have some kind of local interactions, meaning reproduction and selection on this lattice model in addition to diffusion, you have pattern formation and biodiversity. And the way we could understand pattern formation in the system was by mapping the whole thing on this complex Ginsburg-Lambda equation and then see that the solution of that equation are spiral waves with a certain wave velocity and wavelength. And an important conclusion from the analysis was that as a function of diffusion constant or mobility, there is a threshold which defines two distinct regions. If diffusion constant is low, then you have these patterns in the system. The system spends a lot of time in the vicinity of the reactive fixed point, and it seems that the extinction time which you have scales exponential in the system size. In contrast, if you're above this critical value of diffusion constant, you mix the system well, you drive the system in a situation where effectively on a larger scale your reactive fixed point becomes, so to say, unstable. The extinction time scales logarithmically in n, and then you have loss of biodiversity on that time scale. Okay, I know it's a school and I've given a lecture on these systems, but still there are a lot of people who were involved in that work, and I want to thank them. The one who did most of the work was really Tobias Reichenbach. He did his PhD thesis on that, and he really put a lot of effort, creativity into the project. He is now at Rockefeller working with Jim Hudspeth on the physics of hearing. We also had a very nice interaction with Mauro Mobilia, who came from Uber's group. He was involved in the beginning of the project, and he contributed, of course, with his knowledge about Lotka-Volterra systems and many ideas to the project. More recently, Jonas Krämer and Maximilian Baer. Jonas is here. They also contributed to the project. Jonas worked on two-player games. I think he had a poster on that, and on the influence of stochasticity on the two-player game. And Maximilian Baer, who was the student who worked on the law of the weakest. Good, I think that's it. I'm a bit early, but then we have maybe time for questions. Thanks for your attendance.
So yes, we have ample time for discussion.
So let's start with a technical question. On your slide, that is quantum propagation. I don't really understand how you do Fourier transform, because apparently your k is imaginary, the wave vector.
Yeah.
But I mean, how does this do, for example, with imaginary k vector?
To do Fourier transform as usual, it's a real k, right? Let's do it one-dimensional. And you have a one-dimensional Fourier transform, and you can deform the integration path which runs along the real axis in the complex plane, as usual, if there are appropriate, if the function falls off appropriately in the limit of k going to infinity along the imaginary axis. And that's what you do. You just integrate by calculus.
So you can first do all the tricks, but when you look at the formula, you have this one for omega and you have imaginary k in the formula. So how do you interpret that?
No. What comes out is, as you see from the equation, the velocity is the imaginary part of omega divided by the imaginary part of this saddle point k star. So it's a real number.
Yeah, but up to this point, k was real, right?
The k, the integral over k is first of all real, right? And then it's a question of how I do the integral along the k-axis. And that's just standard, complex calculus. You do the integral such that you do a saddle point expansion around the point k star, which is then necessarily in the complex plane. Right? What you graphically, it's you have your complex plane, and you want to do the Fourier transform, and you have to do it along the real axis. And then I use complex calculus.
Okay, so you just kind of.
And what I do is, if I look at the integrand, the integrand is oscillating wildly, right? It's e to the I. And I take that particular point in the complex plane where the oscillation is smallest. That's where the derivative of, so what you have here is I omega of k minus v star k, right? That's the expression in the exponent. And the most important contribution to the integral comes from those points where this term varies the least. So that means I take d dk of omega of k minus v star k at some point k star equal to 0. And that's a point somewhere here in the complex plane. And what I do is I expand my integral, I deform the contour, so I only know where it is here, so essentially I have to deform the contour somehow like that, which I can do if I don't hit any pole. So what I'm assuming is that this function c hat of k is an entire function, so that we don't have a pole, and I can deform then the contour integral. And now I say the most important contribution comes from the vicinity of the saddle point. And then the integral, which I get, is up to a constant equal to the exponential of minus I omega of k star minus v star k star. That's the value of the integral. That's the complex calculus part. And the second condition is, as I said, this solution now in the reference frame, so I have to add something, spatial part, in the reference frame of the front should neither grow nor shrink, and that gives me a second condition. And those two conditions together give me the quantity I'm interested in, which is v star. And k star is just, some intermediate concept I need to evaluate the integral. It doesn't have a physical meaning in that sense. So if you want to interpret k star, then of course you would need it to be real, but it's some intermediate quantity.
Yeah.
How sensitive are your conclusions to the fact that you had exactly 3 species and exactly this type of interaction? If you had 2 or more slightly different interactions, do you get the same spiral waves?
No. It depends on the number of individuals. And what it really depends on is my reactive manifold. So if I have 2 species, I would get a very different story. There, just the phase plane is very different. But say I would go to 4 or 5 species. The question which really you have to ask is there a reactive fixed point somewhere? And what's the geometry of your reactive manifold? If it happens that the geometry of the reactive manifold of this 5-dimensional problem is a 2-dimensional reactive manifold with a structure where you have an unstable center and some kind of limit cycle, then you get the same kind of stuff. If you get something else, you get something different. So my claim would be the structure of the reactive manifold and the dynamics on the reactive manifold is the universality concept which you need to determine the behavior of the system.
Look a little care there, because to obtain that still in kind of field approximations, you need some stability of that manifold against, including noise. And that's not so if that topology is preserved under noise.
Yeah, exactly. That's a caveat. What you would really need to do is the following. You have to add the noise and eliminate the noise and get an effective non-dynamics, which then would not push you out of this nonlinear manifold. That's a good point, yeah.
So, a couple of questions in there. Yeah, so
I was curious about observation of spiral waves in experiments. So in the kind of E. coli plate experiments, maybe there was some hint in that direction. Are there any other experimental comparisons?
We are working on it. That's the short answer. For the experiment in the care group, you wouldn't expect spiral waves. The reason is their bacteria don't really move. They don't have flagella, so the only way they propagate is by
D equals 0.
Yeah, D is equal to 0. So that's one answer for that. Now you could add flagella and see what happens. The difficulty one really has in analyzing the system experimentally is that the division time of E. coli is about 20 minutes. So the time scale to observe the system would be weeks and months, maybe. That's not really feasible. So what we did is we dug the 3 strains of E. coli from the care group and marked them with different colors, GFP, YFP, some other color, and then studied what happens as the system grows. Then you have similar phenomena as the ones David Nelson and Oskar Halacek observed, where they have an initial seed of bacteria, just 2 of them, and then the most prominent feature you see as you start a bacterial colony to grow from a seed is that the bacteria kind of conquer the empty space which is ahead of them. And on a much larger time scale, after they have conquered the land which is ahead of them, they will start doing the cyclic dynamics. But as I said, this is on a time scale which is really hard to observe because it's on a something like month time scale.
Is there anything special that happens at the spiral wave centers, and why? Is there like a physical sort of interpretation for what happens then?
Could you rephrase it? I didn't get it.
Where the centers of the spirals are, how is that fixed?
How is that fixed?
Yeah, what determines where the centers are?
Okay, good question. What you can do is it's random, so it depends on the initial condition. Maybe I'll show you in transparency where we start. Okay. So here, those are 2 different simulations. This here is with a homogeneous random initial condition, and then where the centers of those spirals form is a matter of luck. Once they are emerging and there's some spiral being generated, they just fix them in space by a feedback kind of mechanism. What we did there is that we didn't start with a random initial condition, but we put a very large spatial modulation, and then the initial spatial modulation determines where the spirals are. So the conclusion from that is if you have, instead of a noise term, a large variation in the initial condition, you can make patterns as you like, and you determine where the spiral waves are. That's interesting too from a perspective of nonlinear dynamics and equilibrium physics. Here this shows that the stationary state is not independent of the initial condition. If the variation in the initial condition is strong, the stationary state has a perfect memory of the initial condition.
Is there a critical value of the noise that washes out that memory?
Yeah. You can.
And you can calculate that.
Well, it's kind of obvious. The amplitude of the noise has to be comparable to the amplitude of the variation. So it's just a competition between both. Okay. And the reason is these structures, once they are formed, they have such a stability by the feedback which is in the system that you can't destroy them anymore. And you will need a really strong noise to make, the motion of those spiral waves deviate, and you see you need to break up a perfect pattern. And that's very hard, as in critical phenomena. If you have a system which is magnetized upwards, even if it's possible to go down, it just takes, ages of the universe for the system to flip. The same is true here.
In these finite systems.
In this finite system.
However, biology is very finite, so these transients, which if we are in our condensed matter world, sometimes we tend to think about the thermodynamic limit and all this is gone. But it's these transients that are the fun in this biology.
So when you said this here, do you mean the quasi-stationary state is memory? I mean, so if you were to have the infinite time limit of infinite computing power, would it still go to different?
If you would have infinite time, you would always get extinction.
Okay, so when you're saying when you had that statement there, you mean it's kind of like on the time scale that you're simulating it?
Well, as I just said, it's the long time transients that are, however, the really relevant things.
Yeah. See, the time scales here are exponential in the system size. Just take a bacterial colony of 10 to the 8 bacteria, which is a small number. So we have e to the 10 to the 8. That's larger than the number of vacua the string theorists have.
And we were talking about absorbing phase transitions a lot. And in any finite system, the unique stationary state is everything is gone and dead. So you couldn't even talk about these transitions. There's an active state in the finite system, in the finite system. So what you have to do is actually, it's akin to critical phenomena in equilibrium. You first have to take the thermodynamic limit, then hit TC. Here you have to do the same. You first have to do the infinite system limit, look at infinite times, and then control your rates to see transitions. If you're a purist, any experimental system is never there. In any experimental system, there is no phase transition between these things. In the same manner, there's no absorbing state. That doesn't mean you don't actually see this stuff. Okay? Because you don't have the infinite time limit to actually ever play with. So, I mean, thanks. I don't know if that confused or helped, but that's really the issue. And then in biology, where you're not even talking about 10 to the 23, individuals with maybe 1,000, a million or something if you're lucky, right? Yeah. In these experiments, it was more like 300 bacteria or something. So you really need to watch these transients. That's where all the physics happens.
And in addition, you have changes in the climate, you have changes in the environment, and things like that. So the questions you have to ask are always on a finite time scale.
No, we do that in physics too. We just ignore that, right? Everything is on a time scale of your experiment, and you also don't want the universe to evolve so much while you do it. Right? It just becomes more explicit here. You just need to keep it in mind. Yes.
So you briefly mentioned that when the field is small enough, the system is super expensive. Is that also correct?
Did I say that?
I mean, you mentioned very briefly that in your spatial system, the scaling with the extinction of the average extinction time with population size is super extensive.
Okay, so in the biodiverse state, if you just ask how long will it take for the system to die out, then it would scale exponentially then.
So you achieve it like from simulation?
Yeah.
Or
no, that's an observation which we have from simulations. And I don't have an analytical answer to that, but we could speculate. I mean, if you look at the spatial system, and you saw the simulation in this demonstration project, what happens in the spatial system effectively, just coarse grain to a collected variable describing the whole system, it seems that the probability distribution of the trajectories on the phase plane of the global concentration of A, B, and C runs on some kind of limit cycle. So what we would need to prove mathematically a statement that the extinction time goes exponentially in, that the effective dynamics which you could derive on the system, the global scale, has some kind of fuzzy limit cycle. Since then you would have a barrier for the system to cross, And once you have a barrier, you simply into Arrhenius kind of arguments, and then you must have an exponential dependence of the extinction time on system size. But I couldn't show that.
But if you try to set up a simulation so that you are on the other side of the barrier, so to speak, you come back to a limit cycle, did you try something like that? Because if it's a barrier, then it should be attractive, right? So you should
no, it's not attractive.
I mean, it's not, like if you start very close to the barrier, you should go back to your state, right?
No, once you're in the absorbing state, you can't get out.
No, not absorbing. So you have a barrier, right? And you start not beyond the barrier, but on the outside of the barrier, so you would sort of slide down.
That's a good idea. That's a good idea because So what you would have is you have this simplex, and this is the reactive center, and now you have this fuzzy kind of limit cycle. And what you're saying is once you start here with your system or somewhere at the boundary, there should be a tendency to go to the limit cycle.
Or if you start inside the neutral.
Yeah, it should go in, on average.
Yeah?
No, I haven't done this. Good question. Thanks.
It's just generic initial conditions, right? I mean, you could try different initial conditions.
I could take extreme initial conditions which are more towards the boundary and then see whether the system is attracted inwards to some kind of limit cycle. That's a good idea. Thanks.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering how things might change if you tried a different migration rule than pure diffusion, like what I talked about yesterday, where we say that only those with the local growth rate below some threshold will move, and the ones who are comfortable stay home. How that might change? There seems to be.
It will certainly change. I mean, I don't know, but let's speculate.
Yeah.
So, if you change the rules by which you diffuse, that means you change the term d Laplacian of A. Right? In essence, you're saying that the diffusion constant d depends on configuration.
Yeah.
And that would mean now, as you have, now it depends on whether d is larger as it goes to red, green, or blue. So you would have certain tendencies of the system to move. So I would expect that my spiral location is no longer stationary, because you prefer diffusion in certain directions. And I would guess my spirals would move. So once they start moving, they collide, and then it's no longer sure whether the colliding spirals actually survive in the structure. They could, just wash them out, and you could lose the structure of your spiral waves. That's one option. Another would be you could get traveling waves which are uniaxial or something like this. But I would rather guess that you kind of have these collisions of spiral waves which changes the structure quite dramatically. What we have actually, that's something I didn't talk about. It's where is it? So what you can do is you can, instead of having this two-step process of selection and growth, I could go back to my original rock sister paper where I don't have an intermediate state. That means I don't have empty sites. You would think that doesn't change much, but it changes everything. And what happens is, as you kind of change the weight of this term versus that term, so on going from here to there, I have put more weight on the dynamics which has no empty sites. Then there is a critical value of this weight parameter, weighting this kind of reaction term, where my centers of the spiral waves show an Eckhouse instability, and that just means that they start moving. So they have a finite velocity. And that leads to collision of my spirals, and as you see, it washes out the structure, and as you go to larger and larger parameters, you completely lose your spatial pattern. Doesn't mean that you don't have correlations, you still have correlations, in the same kind of wavelength as you have here, but you lose your nice structures.
So on the right there, I'm still seeing a mixture of
it's just blurred. It's still all three species, but the spatial structure is more like a fractal structure. It's no longer this nice. So here you see. So you would see, as you would watch this, some kind of noisy pattern going in and out, but you no longer would have the path. So really, I mean, changing the rules has an effect, and in particular, if you change rules which make your spiral smooth, that's something which would be of dramatic influence. Yeah.
So in the first lecture, you showed us a slide with real data to measure populations of lizards, and it looks very different, right? They have damped oscillations.
Yes.
So do you have any idea why nature behaves differently from what your
so
suggests?
For the lizards, I mean, lizards are not homogeneously mixed. So
they have a spatial model, right?
No, not really. Not really. This is, first of all, a low number of these guys. They have their niches, there's a very different spatial structure. My spatial structure is completely homogeneous.
So did you try to put spatial disorder to see if you can dampen oscillations?
That's a good point. If you do it, so if you put kind of a maze in there, you of course change things, right? You have well mixing within local mazes, right? And then you, instead of having spiral waves, you have a deterministic scenario, right? And then you would have cyclic dynamics maybe. So if you take the instead of empty sites, just this direct dominance model, then I would expect if you have some smaller local mazes, you could have periodic oscillations there. That has an influence for sure. Because as I said, I mean, the diffusion constant hitting the system size is the mechanism by which you get to a well-mixed scenario. And if you isolate populations on smaller scales, you just make them well-mixed on that smaller scale, and you do get some cyclic dominance. You only have to explain then why the cyclic dominance is so prominent, and why on the time scale of observation you don't see the stochastic effects. So you would need to explain why you have periodic oscillations. And now you could argue, well, maybe this damping here is from the mixing and final decay. But there's so many ecological factors which I'm not in control. So I'm really there.
It seems like, and I don't remember the data, but it seems that it sort of converged to the rapid fix point, which in your case is unstable. But in the data set, it's actually stable, right?
Yeah.
That's a very different behavior.
Yeah. I didn't try to think about this at all. Since, I mean, once I've read the paper and I've looked at all the ecological problems which could eventually, show up there, and all the parameters which I can't control at all, I think it's a bit of a hopeless endeavor to try to explain the details of that observation. It could have so many reasons that I wouldn't be confident in making a claim that the mechanism which I see here is responsible for damped oscillation there.
Okay, more questions? Well, thanks for that very nice explanation.